What would collapse inside each one of us? When one of humanity's defining symbols of courage is erased before it ever exists. Imagine a world where Michelangelo never touches the marble that becomes the David, where the block shatters in a courtyard in Florence, and the young sculptor who should have carved it dies under the rubble. In that world, the Renaissance doesn't ignite the way it's supposed to. Art doesn't push as hard. Power doesn't get questioned as loudly. The idea of what a human being can be, what we can stand for, never reaches the height it does in ours. That collapse didn't happen here. But it did happen in a parallel dimension close enough to our Earth to cause instability. I'm Peter Hale. I'm an active duty time travel agent for the Outer Agency, operating out of Arcturus. So here's what went down. I was in my quarters reviewing mission notes from a previous assignment when the call came through. A soft chime, steady and unmistakable, the sound the Outer Agency uses when duty is not optional. I set the tablet aside and stood, already knowing Graham would be receiving the same alert. Mandatory summons. I set the tablet down and stepped into the corridor. Graham McKay was already heading for the briefing hall, moving with that deliberate, unhurried confidence he never has to announce. Broad-shouldered, built like the highlands that raised him, McKay comes out of the late 1200s and serves as my right hand on most missions. The one man I trust to stand at my side when things turn dangerous. We'd both seen the same report. We both knew what kind of mission starts when a symbol like the David goes missing from history. The briefing hall doors opened as we approached. Ayanna Redbird was already inside, standing near the central projection table. Her long braids were wrapped in red cloth, and the soft lines of her face carried the calm of someone who sees more than she ever says. She nodded once when she saw us. The Outer Agency's projection grid flickered to life above the table. Thousands of alternate Earths suspended in a lattice of light. One of them pulsed with a dull red glow. Ayanna spoke first. Another collapse. Her voice carried the weight of knowing exactly what that meant. The agency's voice followed, steady, resonant, and clear. Agents Hale, McKay, and Redbird. A critical divergence has occurred on an alternate Earth. The marble block intended for Michelangelo's David was destroyed. The artist was killed in the collapse. The Renaissance failed to ignite. The grid zoomed in on the collapse timeline. I saw the courtyard of the Opera del Duomo in Florence, the cathedral workshop where the massive marble block had rested for decades. But in this timeline, the block was shattered into jagged pieces. Dust hung in the air, and beneath the rubble lay the unmistakable form of a man whose work would have shaped centuries. Michelangelo Buonarroti. His body lifeless. The agency continued. The destruction was not accidental. A Medici adversary, aligned with Draco-reptilian interests, infiltrated the workshop. The enemy is a shapeshifter. Its objective is to prevent the creation of the David, destabilizing cultural evolution across time and space. Graham's jaw tightened. He had no love for shapeshifters. I studied the projection. The marble block, quarried in Carrara. Abandoned for 40 years due to imperfections. It was more than stone. It was a watershed moment. Michelangelo's The David would become a symbol of human potential, courage, and identity. Its absence would ripple across centuries. The agency's voice deepened. The enemy has crossed into your Earth's timeline. It is currently operating in Florence, year 1501. Its goal is unchanged. Ayanna stepped closer to the projection, her eyes narrowing. Michelangelo must live, she said softly. The agency confirmed. Agents Hale and McKay will travel to Florence. Redbird will remain until the timeline stabilizes. She will join if Michelangelo is injured. Graham nodded once and we exited the briefing hall. Ayanna walked with us through the corridor, her steps quiet, her presence grounding. The chamber doors opened, revealing the circular platform where time folded like fabric. The portal shimmered, a soft golden light, warm and steady. We paused before entering to face Iana Redbird. She turned to us, her expression calm but firm. "You'll be stepping into a city where power moves like water," she said. "Florence is beautiful, but it is also political. The Medici have enemies everywhere. Some human, some not. Michelangelo is young in 1501. He is fierce and proud, and so very brilliant, but he is not yet the man history remembers. He is vulnerable to manipulation. And the block is flawed. Many sculptors refused it. The enemy will use that." Graham crossed his arms. "Where do we find this shapeshifter?" Iana met his gaze. "In the shadows of influence. The Medici have rivals who would love to see Florence's artistic rise crumble. The enemy will hide among them. It will look human. It will speak like them. It will move through their circles." She turned to me. "Peter, Michelangelo will trust you if you speak plainly. He respects clarity. He respects conviction. He does not respect flattery." I nodded. "I'll remember." She faced Graham. "And you, he will trust your strength. He grew up around stone cutters and laborers. He understands men who work with their hands." Graham gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Iana stepped between us, placing a hand on each of our shoulders. "Stay close to each other. The enemy will try to separate you. It will try to isolate Michelangelo. It will try to destroy the block when no one is watching." She paused. "And remember, the Draco-reptilians do not fear art. They fear what art awakens in humanity." Her words settled into me like a stone dropped into water. She continued. "Florence will welcome you," she said, "but do not forget why you are there. The enemy will not attack openly. It will sabotage. It will whisper. It will manipulate. It will strike when Michelangelo is alone." She placed her hand on my chest, just above my heart. "Lead with truth." Then she placed her hand on Graham's arm. "And strike fast and hard." She stepped back. Graham looked at me. I looked at him. The portal door stirred, then opened with a low, steady vibration that seemed to shift the room itself. Graham and I stepped forward together. Crossing the threshold always carries that brief distortion. The air thickening, the light tilting, the sense that time is folding in on itself. The moment stretches, just enough to make you aware that you're leaving one world behind. Sound drops out. Color changes. The floor feels both solid and not. It's the kind of transition where everything familiar slips for an instant, replaced by the pull of whatever waits on the other side. And then the displacement took hold. Florence rose around us in the early light, its narrow streets already alive with movement. The portal sealed behind us, leaving only the city and the countdown. 48 hours. That was all we had. Graham checked the pocket watch synced to the destruction timestamp. 47 hours, 53 minutes, he said. We crossed the piazza toward the cathedral workshop. The courtyard behind Santa Maria del Fiore was quiet, save for the scrape of clay under Michelangelo's hands. He didn't notice us at first. He was bent over a small clay torso, shaping the shoulder with slow, deliberate pressure. He stepped back, frowned, leaned in again. His thumb pressed into the rib line, then paused. He muttered to himself, "No, that's not it. Something's missing." He studied the clay from another angle. The strength is there, but the life isn't. He didn't look at us. He didn't ask who we were. He simply returned to the clay, searching for something he couldn't name. That moment mattered. We didn't know how much yet. When he finally noticed us, he wiped his hands on a cloth. "You're the men sent by the guild?" "Yes," I said. "Security." He nodded once, already half back in his work. Michelangelo wasn't the kind of man who wasted attention. The marble block stood upright in the center of the courtyard, towering over everything. Sunlight caught the rough surface, revealing old chisel marks from abandoned attempts decades earlier. Michelangelo gestured toward it without looking away from his clay. "I begin work tomorrow." Tomorrow. The day before the destruction. Graham scanned the courtyard with the quiet focus of someone trained to detect anomalies. Nothing obvious. Nothing suspicious. Just Florence breathing around us. But the air just felt off. Not wrong. Not dangerous. Just slightly misaligned, like a room where one object had been moved half an inch. Temporal presence leaves a signature, and Graham felt it too. Michelangelo stepped inside the workshop to fetch a tool. Graham and I remained in the courtyard. A man passed along the far wall. Not close. Not lingering. Just passing, or so it seemed. He moved with perfect Renaissance poise, but with a precision that didn't belong to the era. His stride was too balanced. His posture too efficient. His gaze too neutral. He didn't look at the block. He didn't look at us. He didn't look at Michelangelo. He looked at nothing. He reached the end of the courtyard and turned behind the scaffolding. There was no exit there. Graham's voice was low. He didn't come in through the gate. I nodded. And he didn't leave through it. Michelangelo returned, unaware anything had happened. What are you watching? He asked. Just the courtyard, I said. He accepted that without question. We stayed close to Michelangelo as he worked. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. His focus was absolute. He shaped the clay torso again, then stopped abruptly. Still wrong, he murmured. Still missing something. He pressed his thumb into the sternum, then shook his head. It needs more. He didn't know what more meant. Not yet anyways. We walked the perimeter of the courtyard, studying the angles, the shadows, the scaffolding. The infiltrator wasn't scouting, he was positioning. He needed a moment alone with the block. We needed to make sure he never got it. Inside the cathedral, the air felt heavier, not ominous, just dense with centuries of prayer and stone. We walked the nave quietly, scanning the edges of the space. A faint smell of ozone drifted near the side chapel. Graham touched the stone wall. Temporal residue, he murmured. Someone had been here recently. Someone not from this century. Michelangelo was focused on his work. He didn't see the danger. He didn't need to. That was our job. We returned to the courtyard. Michelangelo stood beside the block, studying it with a sculptor's intensity. He didn't see the infiltrator. He didn't sense the temporal residue. He didn't notice the wrongness in the air. But he felt something. He looked at me. If someone intends to strike, he said quietly, they will do it soon? I nodded. Yes. He looked at the block again. Then we watch. Graham stepped beside him. We watch. Michelangelo accepted that without question. He didn't know how close the danger was. He didn't know how much depended on the next 44 hours. He didn't know the spark of inspiration he was searching for in clay would arrive in the most impossible way. But he would very soon. Evening settled over Florence with surprising gentleness. The last warmth of the sun lingered against the great dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, turning the stone a deep shade of amber before surrendering to twilight. Shopkeepers drew in their signs. Bakers carried fresh loaves from glowing ovens. The fragrance of warm bread drifted through the narrow streets, mingling with the sharper scent of cut marble and damp limestone. For a few precious moments, the city seemed untouched by danger. It was almost enough to make me forget why we were there. Michelangelo did not share the city's peace. He stood before the clay figure with his arms folded tightly across his chest, studying it from every angle. He circled it once, then again. He reached forward and reshaped the shoulder with careful fingers before stepping back. His expression darkened. No, he exclaimed. He flattened the shoulder with the side of his hand. Again he sculpted. Again he stepped back. Again he frowned. Graham leaned quietly against a stone pillar, saying nothing. He had learned long ago that creative frustration was not something to interrupt. Neither had I. Michelangelo worked another quarter hour before suddenly driving both hands into the clay. The torso collapsed beneath his palms. Dio mio, he muttered. He closed his eyes. I know every muscle. His voice was almost a whisper now. I know every tendon. He pressed his fingertips against the ruined figure. I know the skeleton beneath the flesh. He looked at us, frustration giving way to exhaustion. So why? He searched for the words. Does it still refuse to live? Neither Graham nor I answered. I wasn't sure there was an answer anyone could give. Michelangelo paced the workshop. I have studied corpses. He spoke matter-of-factly as though discussing weather. I have measured shoulders. I have studied hips, knees and hands. He held up his own. I know exactly how the human body is built. He looked back at the ruined clay. But knowledge is not enough. He struck the work table with the side of his fist. There is something else. His eyes lifted toward the towering marble block waiting patiently in the courtyard. I simply cannot see it. The silence stretched. Outside, the cathedral bells marked the passing hour. Michelangelo removed his apron with an irritated tug and threw it onto a bench. If I remain here another minute, he sighed heavily, I shall begin arguing with the stone. That earned the faintest smile from Graham. Michelangelo noticed. You laugh. I've known about stubborn stone before, Graham replied. Michelangelo studied him. You've worked quarries? Aye. The answer was simple. Nothing more. Michelangelo seemed unexpectedly pleased. Then you understand. I understand that stone wins arguments. And for the first time all day, Michelangelo laughed. It was brief. It was warm and entirely genuine. You are wiser than most sculptors. He reached for his cloak. I require wine. He fastened it around his shoulders. And perhaps terrible music. He pointed toward the clay. Do not touch it. Then toward the marble. And certainly do not touch that. We'll see it remains untouched, I assured him. I hope so. He pulled open the workshop door. If inspiration chooses to arrive while I'm gone. He smiled tiredly. Tell it I'll return shortly. Then he disappeared into the evening streets. The courtyard became remarkably still. The kind of stillness that allows a person to notice things usually overlooked. A pigeon landing on the cathedral roof. The distant rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer. The soft scrape of leaves carried across ancient stone by a cooling breeze. Graham slowly crossed to the marble block. He placed one weathered hand against its rough surface. It almost feels warm. The sun held it all afternoon. I said. He nodded thoughtfully. No. He looked at me. I don't mean from the sun. I walked over beside him. The marble was cool beneath my fingertips, but there was something difficult to describe. Not warmth. Potential. As though the stone itself were waiting. I understand him now, I said quietly. Who? Michelangelo. Graham glanced back toward the abandoned clay model. He isn't trying to carve a man. He's trying to carve an idea. The Scotsman considered that a difficult thing to do. He replied. The hardest. We stood in silence. The marble towered above us like a sleeping giant. It had waited nearly 40 years for the right sculptor. It could wait one more night. A cart rattled past beyond the courtyard wall. Voices drifted from nearby taverns. Someone laughed. Then another sound reached us. It was soft. Almost too soft to notice. We heard the faint sound of footsteps. Not hurried. Not cautious. Measured footsteps. I looked toward the entrance. A Dominican friar crossed the courtyard carrying a bundle wrapped in linen. His head remained bowed. His pace never changed. He acknowledged neither Graham nor me. He walked directly toward the opposite gate. And halfway across, he stumbled. The bundle slipped. For an instant the cloth fell away. Inside lay ordinary mason's tools. A hammer, chisels, and wooden mallet. Nothing unusual. The friar apologized quietly, gathered his things, continued on his way. The gate closed behind him. Graham waited another few seconds before speaking. That wasn't a friar. I know. I responded. The shoes. I nodded. Dominican monks wore simple sandals. The man who had crossed our courtyard had been wearing finely stitched leather boots beneath his robe. Small detail. Easy to miss. Unless you had spent years noticing details that kept people alive. We followed the friar immediately. The street outside was crowded. Children chased one another between wagons. Women bargained loudly over vegetables. Laborers carried timber toward the cathedral. The friar had vanished. Impossible. The nearest corner was too far away. There had not been enough time. Graham looked both directions. Nothing. I crouched near the street. Fresh dust still floated in the air. Then I saw it. A single footprint. Too deep. As though whoever made it had suddenly become far heavier than an ordinary man. Indication of a temporal transition. The disguise had changed. He had shifted identities. He knows we're watching. Graham's eyes swept across the crowd. Or, he wanted us to follow. Neither possibility was comforting. The remainder of the evening passed without incident. We took turns watching the courtyard while workers gradually departed for the night. One by one the lanterns surrounding the workshop were lit. Long shadows stretched across the stone. The marble block seemed almost luminous beneath the flickering light. Near midnight, the foreman arrived. He was an elderly mason named Bernardo, broad-shouldered despite his years. He frowned when he found us still awake. "You fellows intend to stand here until sunrise?" "If necessary," Graham responded. He chuckled. "Nothing ever happens here." Graham and I exchanged a glance. History had an unfortunate habit of proving statements like that wrong. Bernardo rested one hand against the marble. "My father worked this block." He smiled wistfully. "He said it was cursed." "Cursed, you say?" I asked. "So many failures." He nodded toward the towering stone. "Two sculptors abandoned it." He ran rough fingers over an old chisel scar. "Others refused it." And his smile faded. "Sometimes I wonder whether the stone chooses its own master." I looked toward the cathedral. Or perhaps someone had spent decades ensuring no one succeeded. The thought lingered longer than I liked. The bells rang at midnight and everything became quiet. Far too quiet. Even the pigeons nesting beneath the cathedral roof fell silent. Graham slowly straightened. "You feel it?" "I do," I replied. The air itself seemed heavier, not threatening. Somewhere beyond the lantern light, someone else had entered the courtyard. We couldn't see him. Not just yet. But we were no longer alone. No one moved. The silence that had settled over the courtyard no longer belonged to Florence. It belonged to something else. Something was watching us. Graham slowly loosened the leather strap that secured the short axe concealed beneath his cloak. He did not draw it. He merely rested his hand where it could find the handle without looking. "I count 3 lanterns," Graham said quietly. "I know," I replied. "Too many shadows." "I know." A cool breeze drifted through the courtyard, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Yet the evening sky remained perfectly clear. The strange feeling lingered for perhaps 20 seconds and then it was gone. The air lightened. The pigeons returned to their restless murmuring beneath the cathedral roof. Somewhere beyond the walls, a dog barked twice before settling again. Whatever had been watching us had left, or wanted us to believe it had. "We're being measured," Graham observed. I nodded slowly. "He isn't looking for an opening," I said. "What then?" Graham asked, turning toward me. "He's learning." Graham frowned. "Learning what?" "How we move," I answered. The realization settled heavily between us. Every encounter, every glimpse, every disappearance. The infiltrator had never truly tried to kill us. Not once. He had been studying us, learning our habits, our routines. The eastern sky had only begun to pale when the first workers returned. Stone cutters and apprentices. Laborers balancing heavy beams across broad shoulders. Soon the familiar sounds of the workshop returned. Hammers and voices. The scrape of chisels against limestone. Normal life. Exactly what the enemy wanted to hide within. Michelangelo arrived just after sunrise carrying an unfinished loaf of bread beneath one arm. He looked surprisingly refreshed. "I have solved nothing," Michelangelo announced with a weary smile. "But at least I no longer dislike everyone." Even Graham allowed himself the hint of a smile. Michelangelo noticed. "You've been awake all night," he said, studying our faces. "We have," I replied. "You found something?" "We found questions." Michelangelo sighed. "I was hoping for answers," he admitted. "So were we," I said quietly. Without another word, Michelangelo walked directly toward the great marble block. For several long moments he simply stood before it. Then he rested one hand against the cool stone. His expression softened. "I know you are in there," he whispered to the marble. "I only need to find you." His fingertips traced an old scar left by another sculptor decades before. "So many men believed you were ruined," Michelangelo murmured. A faint smile crossed his face. "They were wrong." He stood another minute before turning back toward the workshop. "Come with me," he called to us. "You've decided?" I asked. "No," Michelangelo answered with a small laugh. "But I will begin anyway." The first strike of Michelangelo's hammer echoed across the courtyard like another cathedral bell. Not hard nor dramatic. It was measured and almost respectful. Tiny fragments of marble drifted downward into the morning light. Michelangelo stopped. He studied the surface carefully. He shifted his footing, then struck again. Watching him work was unlike watching any craftsman I had ever known. Nothing was hurried. Every movement seemed to begin long before his hands actually moved. It was as though he carved with thought first, and tools second. By midday nearly a dozen apprentices had gathered to watch. Some whispered admiration. Others whispered doubt. One young sculptor leaned toward his companion. "He'll split the stone within a week," the apprentice muttered confidently. Michelangelo pretended not to hear. A distinguished sculptor from another workshop entered the courtyard. His expensive robes announced success long before he spoke. He circled the marble once, then again. Finally he smiled with carefully disguised amusement. "So tell me, Michelangelo," the older sculptor began, "you truly accepted the giant?" Michelangelo continued working without looking up. "I did," he replied calmly. "A curious decision," the visitor said. Still Michelangelo kept carving. "The flaws remain." "I know that," Michelangelo answered. "The grain twists." "I know it." "The left side is weak." "I know that as well, fine sir." "The proportions can never be corrected." This time Michelangelo lowered his hammer. He turned slowly toward the older man. "I know every flaw in this stone," he said evenly. The visitor folded his arms. "Then why accept the commission?" he asked. Michelangelo rested one hand against the marble. "Because everyone else saw only the damage," he replied. He gently brushed marble dust from the surface. "I see the man." The courtyard fell silent. Even the older sculptor seemed unable to answer. After a long moment he smiled politely. "You're either a genius," he said, "or completely mad." Michelangelo smiled for the first time that morning. "Those are not always different things," he replied. Graham chuckled softly beside me. The older sculptor gathered his robes and departed without another word. His apprentices hurried after him, casting one last doubtful glance toward the towering block of marble before disappearing into the streets. The courtyard gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. Hammers rang against stone. Wooden carts creaked beneath heavy loads. Somewhere beyond the workshop wall, a bell announced the noon hour. Michelangelo scarcely noticed. He had entered that curious state where the rest of the world simply ceased to exist. I watched him work for another hour. He rarely struck the marble more than twice before stepping back to study it. Sometimes he closed one eye, sometimes both. Once, he circled the block 3 complete times without lifting his hammer again, and it occurred to me that he wasn't carving stone. He was listening to it. Graham wandered slowly around the perimeter of the courtyard, never appearing to patrol. That was one of his greatest strengths. He never looked like a guard. He looked like a laborer stretching his legs. His eyes, however, never stopped moving. When he finally returned, he stood beside me without taking his attention from the gate. "Something's wrong," Graham said quietly. "I've been thinking the same thing," I replied. "It's too busy." I nodded. "There have been more visitors today than workers. And none of them stay." We watched another well-dressed gentleman step through the entrance. He exchanged a few polite words with one of the apprentices, glanced toward Michelangelo's work, then continued through the courtyard without the slightest interest in anything else. 30 seconds later, he was gone. Graham frowned. "That's the 8th. I counted 9. He looked at me. "You saw another?" The man dressed as a monk. Recognition crossed Graham's face. I'd nearly forgotten him. Our attention shifted toward Bernardo. The old mason was organizing chisels beneath a covered workbench. I walked over. "Busy day," I said. Bernardo looked up and smiled. "Busier than I've seen in years," he replied. "The guild has become remarkably interested in our work." "Does that happen often?" I inquired. Bernardo laughed softly. "Never." He selected another chisel and examined its edge against the light. "I've worked in this yard for 23 years. He shook his head. "I've never seen so many officials visit a single project." "Did they all belong to the guild?" The old mason hesitated. "Now that you mention it." He looked thoughtfully toward the gate. "No. Some introduced themselves. Others didn't. And one," he frowned, "asked very strange questions." "What kind of questions?" I replied. Bernardo lowered his voice. "He wanted to know who remained in the courtyard after sunset." My pulse quickened. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." Bernardo shrugged. "Usually no one." He looked toward Graham. "But now," he smiled, "both of you stand guard." I thanked him and returned to Graham. "He knows we'll be here tonight," I said quietly. Graham nodded once. "Good." I looked at him. "You think that's good?" "If he expects us." A faint smile appeared beneath Graham's beard. "He will find that we will be expecting him as well." The afternoon passed without incident. Twice Michelangelo discarded perfectly good chisels because they felt wrong. One apprentice accidentally dropped a heavy mallet from the scaffolding. Another insisted someone had moved his measuring cords. A wheel came loose from a supply cart for no apparent reason. Each event seemed ordinary. Each could be explained away. Yet together they formed a pattern. Small disturbances, tiny disruptions. Never enough to stop the work. Just enough to erode confidence. I found Michelangelo studying the damaged wheel while the laborers repaired it. "Bad luck?" I asked. Michelangelo didn't answer immediately. Finally he looked at me. "I don't believe in luck," he replied. "What do you believe?" He looked toward the marble. "I believe every problem has a cause." He brushed stone dust from his sleeves. "The challenge is discovering it." He smiled faintly. His words lingered in my mind long after we resumed our watch. As evening approached, the workers departed one by one. The noise of the workshop slowly faded until only 4 people remained. Michelangelo, Graham, myself and Bernardo. The old mason collected his lantern. "I'll return before sunrise," he said. Michelangelo finally looked away from the marble. "Get some rest, my friend," he told him. Bernardo nodded respectfully. "You should do the same." Michelangelo smiled without humor. He gestured toward the unfinished figure emerging from the stone. "I will once he allows me." The old mason laughed. "I suspect he'll keep you awake for weeks." "I suspect you're right." Bernardo disappeared through the gate. The heavy wooden door closed behind him. Its echo rolled across the empty courtyard. Then we were alone. The first stars appeared above Florence. Lantern light flickered across the rough face of the marble, causing shadows to drift slowly across its unfinished surface. Michelangelo lowered himself onto a weathered wooden stool. He rubbed the ache from his hands before finally breaking the silence. "May I ask you both something?" Michelangelo said quietly. "Of course," I replied. Michelangelo looked first at Graham, then at me. "You've both seen soldiers." "We have," I answered. "Many soldiers?" "Far more than either of us ever wished." Michelangelo nodded thoughtfully. He rested both hands upon the handle of his hammer. "Tell me this." His voice became almost reflective. "What does a man look like the moment before he decides not to run?" The question lingered between us. Finally, Graham answered. "He is quiet," he said softly. Michelangelo lifted his eyes. "Quiet?" he repeated. Graham nodded. "The shouting comes afterward." He looked toward the cathedral towers silhouetted against the evening sky. "Before the battle." He paused. "A man remembers why he's there. He thinks of home. He remembers the people depending on him and steadies his breathing. He accepts what may come." Graham's voice remained calm. "There comes a moment when fear is still present, but it no longer makes the decision." Michelangelo listened without moving. "And courage?" he asked almost in a whisper. Graham smiled faintly. "Courage isn't something a man feels. It is something he chooses." Silence settled over the courtyard once again. Michelangelo slowly rose to his feet. Without another word, he crossed to the marble. He rested one hand against its cool surface. His fingers drifted across the stone as though searching for a face only he could see. Almost unconsciously, Michelangelo shifted his weight onto one leg. His shoulders relaxed. His head turned ever so slightly. I recognized the pose immediately. Michelangelo did not. But something inside him had changed. For the first time, he wasn't searching for the perfect body. He was searching for that defining moment. The moment when resolve overcomes fear. A raven cried somewhere above the cathedral. Graham's expression changed instantly. He looked toward the rooftops. I followed his gaze. A solitary figure stood along the ridge of a neighboring building, perfectly motionless, watching us. Watching Michelangelo. Watching the marble. The man's expensive cloak fluttered gently in the evening breeze. To anyone else, he would have appeared to be nothing more than another wealthy Florentine enjoying the cool air before nightfall. But I knew better. The shapeshifter had chosen another face. Even at this distance, there was something unsettling about him. He stood too still and balanced, like a predator conserving its strength. Neither Graham nor I spoke. We simply watched. After a long moment, the stranger slowly raised one gloved hand. Not in greeting. Not in farewell. It felt more like an acknowledgement, as though he wished us to understand that he knew exactly who we were. Then he stepped backward into the darkness beyond the roofline, and he was gone. Graham kept his eyes fixed on the empty rooftop. "He's finished studying us," Graham said quietly. "I believe you're right," I replied. "What now?" Graham asked. I looked toward Michelangelo, who still stood before the marble, completely unaware that history itself was being hunted. Our adversary has changed tactics. He no longer wants to discourage Michelangelo. Graham looked back toward the empty rooftop. "He intends to end this." I nodded. The evening bells began to ring across Florence. Somewhere in the growing darkness, our unseen hunter was already making his final preparations. And for the first time since arriving in Florence, I had the unmistakable feeling that tomorrow we would not walk away unchanged. Morning arrived beneath a blanket of low gray clouds. The brilliant Tuscan sunlight that had greeted us the day before was gone, replaced by a cool breeze that carried the scent of rain through the streets of Florence. It was the kind of morning that encouraged people to hurry, to keep their heads down, to notice less than they otherwise might. I couldn't help wondering if our enemy had chosen it for precisely that reason. Graham stood beside the courtyard gate, watching the city awaken. "The weather is changing," he said quietly. I joined him. "So is something else," I replied. "We're running out of time." Neither of us needed to check the agency chronometer. We both knew. Less than 24 hours remained before the moment history had nearly unraveled. Michelangelo arrived carrying 2 bundles wrapped in cloth. One contained fresh bread. The other contained new chisels. He looked from Graham to me before setting them on the workbench. "You both have the same expression," Michelangelo observed. "What expression?" I asked. "The one that men wear when they know trouble is coming." Graham smiled faintly. We do." Michelangelo nodded. "My father had that look." He paused. "So did the soldiers who marched through Florence when I was a boy." He unwrapped the chisels one by one, inspecting each edge with a craftsman's eye. He selected the smallest. The day's work began. Michelangelo lifted the hammer and brought it down. He paused to feel the moment. He studied the surface in front of him. He brought the hammer down once more. He paused again. He was listening to the stone as if waiting for guidance. Every strike echoed across the courtyard with measured precision. Slowly and almost imperceptibly, the broad outline of a man began emerging from the stone. First the start of shoulders, the suggestion of a rib cage, the gentle turn of a hip. Nothing was finished. Everything was becoming. By mid-morning, visitors once again drifted through the workshop. A spice merchant, 2 Dominican priests, a courier carrying sealed documents, a woman delivering linen. Each remained only moments. Each looked toward the marble. Each continued on. To everyone else they were ordinary Florentines. To me they had become people of question. "I don't like this," I said quietly as another visitor departed. Graham never looked away from the gate. "Neither do I. They're too comfortable." His eyes followed a young apprentice sweeping marble dust. "They know no one suspects them." I watched the street beyond the wall. Or perhaps. I hesitated. "They aren't all against us." That caught Graham's attention. He turned toward me. "What are you thinking? If you wanted to watch someone, would you become 10 different people?" I said. Graham considered it. "No, I'd become one. And use everyone else without them knowing." The realization settled over both of us. The Draco agent wasn't disguising himself as every passerby. He was influencing ordinary people, turning an entire city into his eyes. Bernardo hurried into the courtyard carrying a rolled parchment beneath his arm. He looked troubled. "Michelangelo," he called. The sculptor lowered his hammer. "What is it?" "The guild." Bernardo handed him the sealed document. "They've ordered another inspection." Michelangelo frowned. "They inspected only yesterday." "I know." He broke the wax seal, his expression darkening as he read. "They want the work stopped." Graham and I exchanged a quick glance. "For how long?" I asked. Michelangelo looked up. "They haven't decided." The sculptor folded the parchment carefully. "They're questioning whether the marble is safe." Bernardo shook his head in disbelief. "They have never questioned it before today." Michelangelo looked toward the towering block. "Now they are." "I'll speak with them," Bernardo offered. Michelangelo smiled gratefully. "You've already done enough." The old mason shook his head. He placed a reassuring hand on Michelangelo's shoulder. "This stone has waited 40 years. He smiled. "It can wait another day." Michelangelo looked down at the parchment. His voice was calm. "No, it has waited long enough." Without another word he folded the order, then tucked it into his belt, picked up his hammer, and resumed carving. I found myself smiling. Graham noticed. "What?" "I finally understand him." "The sculptor?" I nodded. "He isn't stubborn." "What is he then?" I watched Michelangelo strike the marble once more. "He simply refuses to let fear make his decisions." Graham looked thoughtfully toward the unfinished figure. I believe that's true." The afternoon passed peacefully. Too peacefully. Even the pigeons seemed reluctant to disturb the quiet. Then, without warning, a sharp crack echoed through the courtyard. Everyone turned to look. One of the upper scaffold supports had splintered. The heavy wooden platform lurched violently. A laborer cried out. The entire structure began tipping toward the marble. Toward Michelangelo. I shouted for everyone to move. Michelangelo looked up. For one frozen heartbeat. He didn't move at all. The enormous scaffolding groaned. Timbers snapped. A rain of tools crashed toward the courtyard. Graham was already running toward it. He slammed into Michelangelo with enough force to throw them both clear as the scaffolding crashed onto the stone pavement behind them. The impact thundered through the workshop. Dust exploded into the air. Workers screamed. For several terrifying seconds, no one could see anything. When the dust finally began to settle, Michelangelo pushed himself onto one elbow. His eyes searched frantically. Graham. The Scotsman slowly sat up nearby, rubbing one shoulder. I'm still here, he answered with a grim smile. Michelangelo stared at the shattered scaffold, then back at Graham. His voice caught. You ran straight into the collapse. Graham shrugged as though nothing remarkable had happened. It seemed the quickest way. The quickest way? Michelangelo repeated in disbelief. You could have been killed. Graham brushed dust from his sleeves. So could you. The sculptor looked at him for a very long moment. No one spoke. The workers slowly began clearing broken timber. Bernardo organized the apprentices. Voices returned to the courtyard. But Michelangelo never took his eyes off Graham. He wasn't looking at his strength. He wasn't studying his shoulders. He wasn't admiring the muscles beneath his tunic. He was trying to understand why another man would instinctively risk his own life for someone he had met only 2 days before. And for the first time, I believed Michelangelo had begun to see the David. The marble block had escaped any injury. The scaffold was rebuilt before sunset. No one spoke very much while they worked. The apprentices lifted fresh timbers into place. Bernardo inspected every joint himself, running his calloused fingers over each peg and brace as though daring the wood to betray him again. No one mentioned sabotage. No one mentioned murder. Yet every man in the courtyard understood that the day had come far too close to ending in tragedy. Michelangelo resumed his work just before the evening bells. The hammer rose, then fell. A single measured strike echoed through the courtyard. He stepped back, studied the marble, then lowered the hammer again without striking. Something had changed. He was no longer carving to discover the figure. He was carving to reveal it. I found Graham replacing the broken straps on his satchel beneath the tool shed awning. How's your shoulder? I asked. He flexed his arm once before answering. I intend to complain about it tomorrow. I've seen you take lighter blows that kept you in bed for a week. He smiled. I must be getting old. I laughed quietly. I was going to say stubborn. They're much the same thing. For a few precious moments, we allowed ourselves to believe the danger had passed. That was our mistake. Bernardo approached carrying a small wooden box. I found this beneath the scaffold, he said. He handed it to me. It was beautifully made. Walnut. Brass hinges. No markings. I opened the lid. Inside lay 6 ordinary iron nails. Nothing more. I looked at Bernardo. Where exactly did you find it? Wedged beneath one of the support beams. Graham stepped closer. May I? I handed him the box. He turned one of the nails between his fingers. Then another. Finally, he held one close to his nose. His expression changed. These aren't from Florence. How can you tell? I asked. The smell. I frowned. The oil. He held the nail toward me. I caught it immediately. Not linseed oil. Not animal fat. It carried the faint metallic scent of synthetic lubricant. Far too modern. Someone had planted the box. Not to help sabotage the scaffold, but to see if anyone would recognize it. Our unseen adversary wasn't merely trying to destroy history anymore. He was testing us. "He knows we're investigators," I said quietly. Graham nodded. "And now he knows we're observant." Neither thought was comforting. Michelangelo wandered over, wiping marble dust from his hands. "You both look as though you've discovered another mystery," he said. "We may have," I replied, closing the box. He glanced at it. "Should I ask?" I smiled. "Not this time." He looked toward the marble. "I have enough puzzles already." The sculptor stood silently before the unfinished figure. "I think I understand something now," he said after several moments. Neither Graham nor I interrupted. "I've spent years studying strength." He rested his hand against the stone. "Strength is easy." He looked down at his own hands. "Any butcher understands muscle." His voice grew quieter. "But greatness." He searched for the word. "Greatness begins before the first movement." He turned toward Graham. "When you pushed me clear of the scaffold." Graham looked uncomfortable. "I wasn't thinking." Michelangelo smiled gently. "Exactly." He tapped one finger against the marble. Whatever this young shepherd felt before facing Goliath, it wasn't confidence. He looked thoughtfully into the gathering dusk. And it was not certainty. It was something quieter. Graham nodded. I think so." Michelangelo smiled. "I've been trying to carve victory." He shook his head. "I should have been sculpting decision." The cathedral bells announced the evening prayer. Across Florence, merchants closed their shops. Lanterns appeared one by one in the narrow streets. Children disappeared indoors. The city slowed, but not enough to hide what happened next. A woman entered the courtyard carrying a basket of bread. No one paid her much attention. She greeted Bernardo warmly. She smiled at Michelangelo. She crossed the yard at an unhurried pace. Perfectly ordinary. Then she stumbled. The basket struck the ground. Loaves scattered across the stone. Half a dozen apprentices rushed to help. Bernardo bent to gather the bread. Michelangelo stepped forward. Even Graham moved instinctively. For perhaps 3 seconds. Every eye in the courtyard was fixed on the fallen basket. Except mine. I never looked away from the marble. And that's when I saw him. The man behind the marble. He had been there the entire time. Perfectly still. Hidden in the deepening shadows. He had been watching me. Our eyes met. He smiled. Not with triumph. With recognition. Then, before I could move, he stepped backward into the darkness beyond the workshop wall. And vanished. I called for Graham quietly. He looked up immediately. "What is it?" He was here. Graham's expression hardened. I pointed toward the empty shadows behind the marble. "He's been watching us." Bernardo looked up in confusion. "Who's watching you?" I looked at Michelangelo. Then back toward the empty darkness. "No one you'll ever want to meet." I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Graham. The shapeshifter had been close enough for us to look directly into each other's eyes. He wanted us to know that. He wanted us to wonder whether he had already anticipated our every move. Predators often reveal themselves before the final attack. Not from arrogance but from confidence. The streets of Florence were unusually still before dawn. A light mist drifted over the Arno River, softening the outlines of bridges and church towers until the city seemed half-remembered rather than fully awake. Somewhere nearby, a baker opened his oven. The smell of fresh bread floated through the cool morning air. Ordinary life continued. Completely unaware that history stood balanced upon a single block of marble. The great courtyard lay empty. Only the unfinished marble stood waiting beneath the fading stars. I rested my hand against the stone. "So much depends on you." I spoke to the stone. "I've known people with less responsibility." Graham replied with a faint smile. I laughed quietly. "So have I." Michelangelo arrived moments later carrying nothing except his hammer. He looked rested and calm, more at peace than I had seen him since arriving in Florence. "You found something," I said. He smiled. He rested his hand upon the marble. "Actually, it found me." I wasn't sure what he meant. Perhaps he wasn't either. But I believed him. Without another word, he lifted the hammer. The sound that followed seemed different from every strike before it. Not louder, more certain. Each blow removed only the smallest fragment of stone. Yet every fragment revealed purpose. Watching him now, I realized he no longer hesitated. He wasn't searching. He had begun revealing the man he had already seen in his mind. Bernardo entered carrying a lantern. "You have visitors?" he called from the gate. 3 officials from the Wool Guild crossed the courtyard. Their robes were immaculate. They wore severe expressions. The eldest stepped forward. "Master Buonarroti." Michelangelo lowered his hammer. "Good morning." "The guild has reached its decision." Bernardo's shoulders stiffened. "So soon?" he asked. The official ignored him. "The commission is suspended." Silence settled across the courtyard. "For what reason?" Michelangelo asked calmly. "The marble is unsuitable." Michelangelo smiled ever so slightly. "Yesterday you believed otherwise. Yesterday is gone. The decision is final." I studied the 3 men. Their faces betrayed nothing. Yet one detail caught my attention. None of them looked at Michelangelo. Their eyes never left the marble. The shapeshifter wasn't among them. The attack had never been physical alone. It was political. Convinced the guild to abandon the commission. And history would unravel without a single weapon being drawn. Michelangelo stepped forward. With surprising gentleness, he placed his hammer on the workbench. "I've listened respectfully," he said. "Now you'll listen to me." Even the officials seemed surprised. "This marble has been abandoned for 40 years. He rested one hand against its weathered surface. Not because it lacked promise. He looked each man in the eye. But because men lacked courage. The eldest official frowned. "Mind your words." Michelangelo's voice never rose. "You fear failure. You fear ridicule. You fear spending Florence's money on what others have already called ruined." He smiled. "I fear only leaving greatness trapped inside this stone." The courtyard fell silent. Bernardo stared openly. The apprentices had stopped working altogether. Even the officials seemed uncertain how to answer. Finally the eldest sighed. "You are a difficult man." "So I've been told." A reluctant smile crossed the official's face. He looked at the others, then back at Michelangelo. "The guild withdraws its objection." Relief washed over the courtyard. Bernardo laughed aloud. The apprentices erupted in quiet celebration. Michelangelo simply nodded. "Thank you." Then he picked up his hammer and returned to work. Graham leaned toward me. "That wasn't the attack." "No. It was the distraction." I had reached the same conclusion. If I had learned anything about our unseen adversary, it was that he preferred people to look the wrong way. A single pigeon burst from the cathedral roof. Then another. Then dozens. They rose all at once. A gray cloud exploding into the morning sky. Every instinct I possessed came alive. "Graham!" I shouted. He turned instantly. The shapeshifter was already moving. Not from the gate. Not from the rooftops. From beneath the scaffold. He had hidden there before dawn. His borrowed face peeled away like melting wax. Green scales caught the morning light. Amber eyes fixed on the marble. In his hands rested the same strange device we had seen before. Not aimed at Michelangelo. Aimed at the base of the statue. One pulse would fracture the marble from within. "No!" I shouted. The creature activated the device. A brilliant blue light erupted across the courtyard. Time itself seemed to hesitate. The air shimmered. Stone vibrated, and without hesitation, Graham stepped directly into the path of the pulse. The blast struck him squarely in the chest. He staggered, dropped to one knee, but he did not fall. Instead, he planted one hand against the marble, holding himself upright, protecting it. The shapeshifter stared in disbelief. "Why?" the creature hissed. Graham looked up slowly. His breathing was heavy. His shoulder trembled. Then he answered with the simplest words I had ever heard him speak. "Because some things," he drew another breath, "must endure." Everything stopped. Even Michelangelo. His hammer slipped quietly from his hand. He wasn't looking at Graham's strength. He wasn't looking at the creature. He wasn't even looking at the marble. He was watching one ordinary man, choosing to stand, when every instinct must have begged him to fall. I saw it happen. Not in the stone. In Michelangelo's eyes. He had found David. Not the shepherd. Not the hero. The decision. The instant before action. The moment courage defeated fear. I raised my agency emitter. One precise pulse struck the alien device. It shattered into a shower of blue crystal. The shapeshifter recoiled. Its mission had failed. For a heartbeat, our eyes met across the courtyard. There was no hatred in its expression now. Only frustration. "You preserve one victory," it snarled. "There are countless others." I raised my weapon once again and obliterated him. The courtyard became still once more. Michelangelo crossed slowly to Graham. He placed one hand on the Scotsman's shoulder. "I have spent years searching for perfection," he said softly. He smiled. "I was searching in the wrong place." He turned toward the marble. "I do not need a perfect man." His hand rested gently against the stone. "I need a true one." Years later, the world would stand before David and marvel at its beauty. They would study the muscles, the absolute balance, the impossible mastery of marble. Few would realize what they were truly seeing. Not victory, not power, but a quiet moment, when an ordinary young shepherd had already made his choice. They would never know that another ordinary man, a quiet Scotsman named Graham Mackay, had helped history remember what courage looked like. And perhaps that was as it should be. The greatest guardians of history are the ones history never records.